a very long-awaited for guest and author of this monumental book that you see here on the table, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, a very optimistic title with a very long history. Benjamin Nathans is not only the author of this most recent book, which has become, for me personally, настольная книга, or both настольная книга, also bedtime reading, and source for teaching these topics, and just a major source of inspiration. Otherwise, he's also the author of, I won't even try to list them all, but among other books of Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, published by Berkeley in 2002, which received multiple prizes. Benjamin is also a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, as well as to Times Literary Supplement, and he was also engaged in such projects as Museum of Jewish History in Moscow, for which he was a consultant with an architectural firm, Ralph Applebaum Associates. And today, unfortunately, because we are so limited in time, while this book really requires a set of however many chapters at least, right? A set of so many events, separate events. But we will try to kind of condense it as much as possible. And of course, we'll also be taking questions from you, whether or not you have read this book. And if you haven't yet, I personally envy you, long as it is. But again, extremely rich. On a topic, once again, that has been awaiting its biographer. Right, the Soviet dissident movement, everyone has at least heard about it, let alone participate, perhaps, or study, but the phenomenon is just so enormous and kind of weighty, the way it was, that this, in my humble view, is really the first systematic, not only history, but also conceptualization of just what it was. It really goes, even though Benjamin is, of course, first of all an historian, it really goes far beyond that, and in a sense presents this movement, this phenomenon, from multiple angles, perspectives. So please join me in welcoming Benjamin Nathans to Hunter, or welcome back to this room.
Can you hear me in the back? Okay? Okay, so I will not bother with the microphone. What I'd like to do tonight is to spend about 35 minutes giving you a taste of what the book tries to do. The title of the book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, is taken from a toast that the dissidents often made around kitchen tables in Moscow and Kyiv and Leningrad. And I think it captures in a very powerful way for me the combination of boldness and despair that characterized the movement and also the individuals who made it up. The sense that they did have this goal, this new version of the Soviet Union that they were trying to achieve by reforming its legal system and making it a law-abiding state, a more predictable place to live. And they understood at the same time there was a certain hopelessness to that mission. But it didn't stop them from persevering in the cause, and that, I think, is an important lesson in our own time as well. The subtitle of the book is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, and that's play on words. It has two different meanings. One is, I came to the feeling early on when I was doing research for this book that in a way too much attention had been paid to the marquee names that everybody knew at the time, the world-famous figures, the Nobel Prize winners, Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who were literally household names all over the world in the 1970s and 1980s, and who, through a combination of missteps and misinterpretation, were understood by the Western world as being the leaders of the dissident movement. And what I concluded early on was that they were not the leaders of the movement, and even more than that, the movement didn't want to have any leaders. It was a particular kind of social movement that rejected the notion of hierarchy and the division of labor and orders given and orders received per se. It simply didn't want those kinds of habits in its own ranks. From those near-death experiences, it had to reinvent itself and reformat itself. And one of the threads of the narration, the story that I try to tell, is of those near deaths and self-reinventions, and the way it morphed from being a social movement to something that looked much more like an NGO, even though that term didn't really exist or make sense in the Soviet context. So the whole story, in a sense, begins with an eccentric mathematician, or to be more precise, a mathematical logician, who nobody's really heard of. His name is Alexander Sergeyevich Yesenin-Volpin. He was the extramarital son of the very famous Soviet poet Sergei Yesenin. And Volpin was the one who came up with this unlikely strategy of dissenting in the Soviet context, namely to attempt to force or pressure or somehow lead the Soviet government to obey its own laws. It's a deceptively simple strategy, and it relies on the fact that various civil liberties, the protections, or I should say the guarantees of the rights of free speech and free assembly and freedom of the press, are actually inscribed in the Soviet Constitution of 1936, the constitution that's known familiarly as the Stalin Constitution, the constitution that was ratified just months before the most horrendous application of state-sponsored terror was unleashed on the Soviet population, in which hundreds of thousands of people were arrested, executed, some with only a mockery of a trial, and millions more were sent to hard labor to the Gulag. So on the face of it, a document called the Stalin Constitution would not seem to be a likely candidate to serve as anchor of a civil rights movement. And that, in fact, is what the dissident movement was in its first incarnation. It was a movement to make real the civil rights that were already guaranteed by the Soviet legal system, not being actually practiced in real-life cases. And one of those cases involved Yesenin himself, this mathematician, who was arrested in 1949 for writing, you might call them poems. I'd say they probably didn't rise above the level of doggerel. He was a very eminent mathematician, but not much of a poet, despite his father's talent. And some of those poems contained what the KGB decided were anti-Soviet statements. And so Yesenin was arrested, and he received, in a sense, a break from the KGB, and instead of being put on trial and either executed or sent to a labor camp, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. I said he was eccentric. The KGB labeled him schizophrenic, which was a very elastic category for the KGB, but that may have saved his life. In the 1940s, it was considered clemency to be sent to a psychiatric institution, as horrible as that could be. I won't go into all of the other details of Yesenin's biography, except to tell you a little bit about his mind and his work. I said he was a mathematician, but I really should have said more narrowly, he was a mathematical logician. He was interested in the nature of truth statements and what constitutes mathematically true statements. And in the 1950s, he was swept up in a transnational movement known as cybernetics. You may have heard that term. It was invented by a professor at MIT named Norbert Wiener. And cybernetics is an attempt to develop a perfect language for translating all kinds of phenomena, including literature, but also economies and legal systems, into the language of numbers. We would now call it the algorithms of data science. And cybernetics was really the origin of that way of thinking about knowledge. Everything could be translated into equations and algorithms, and by doing that, we would achieve a level of precision and accuracy and rigor and reliability that would open up entirely new possibilities, not just for intellectual labor, but for organizing societies. Wiener was also interested in the movement for what they called ideal language, and cybernetics was in part about creating an ideal, mathematically precise language for everything that would be stripped of all forms of ambiguity, that would be perfectly precise, and especially precise when it came to telling people what they must do, what they are forbidden from doing, and what they are permitted to do. Those are sort of the three moral categories. What you may do, what you must not do, and what you have to do. Like many people who had to spend months and years in prison or in psychiatric hospitals, he spent a lot of time reading the Soviet Constitution and the Soviet legal code. He was, in other words, a kind of jailhouse lawyer. He was an amateur student of Soviet law. And what he found or discovered in Soviet law was a reasonable approximation of an ideal language. A language that attempted to map out with maximum clarity what people were allowed to do, what they were forbidden to do, and what they were permitted to do. And so when he emerged from psychiatric confinement in the 1950s, he also spent a bit of time in internal exile, but when he emerged from this and got back to Moscow, he decided that the Soviet legal system would provide him with the next best thing to a mathematically perfect ideal language, and that he could use this to promote the rule of law, to get the government to obey the already existing statutes of its legal code. Volpin was an obsessive diary keeper, and I worked in the archives of the Memorial Society in Moscow when that still existed. It was liquidated on the eve of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine leading up to February 2022. And his diaries are in that archive. And they are an amazing document tracing the evolution of his thinking about how the rule of law might be made real in the Soviet system. And they also record him, in a sense, waiting, almost like a hunter, for the right occasion to put this idea into practice. That occasion comes along in the fall of 1965, when two Soviet writers, Yuli Daniel and Andrei Sinyavsky, after a long, long hunt for them by the KGB, because they've been publishing under pseudonyms, are unmasked, discovered, and arrested. And Yasha has written about this extensively. It's a very famous case. These two were set to be put on trial in early 1966. And Volpin decided that this was the chance to put into practice these ideas that he had developed about using the Soviet Constitution to put limits on what the state could do. The state had to obey its own laws. And it's in the fall of 1965, between these two writers' arrest and their trial in February of 66, that Volpin organizes something that he calls the transparency demonstration, or the transparency meeting, meeting glasnosti. And if some of your ears are perking up at the sound of the word glasnost, yes, it's the word that Mikhail Gorbachev used as part of his reform campaign in the mid to late 1980s, the campaign known as perestroika, or the rebuilding or renovation of the Soviet system. Glasnost is a Russian word, I would say an ordinary Russian word, not an esoteric Russian word, that can mean openness or publicity or transparency. Volpin displaced the conventional meaning of glasnost and turned it to his project of forcing the Soviet government to obey its own laws. And when he organized this meeting, and he timed it to the anniversary of the ratification of the Stalin Constitution, so December 5th, 1965, he had a very simple and strict agenda for anyone who wanted to participate in this demonstration. The one and only call would be for an open trial. The signs held up would not insist on the innocence of the writers. That was yet to be determined. It would not protest the arrest of creative artists, something that had a long history in the Russian tradition. It would be extremely focused on the purely procedural legal issues. The trial must be open because the Soviet Criminal Code insists that trials be open to the public. And the idea was that the transparency of the trial would guarantee certain procedural norms. In fact, what I found, and what many other people have found, is that Soviet society consisted of small groups held together by very intense bonds of adult friendship. between men and women, between everybody, essentially. And these were circles of people who developed a deep level of trust with each other. And that was in contrast to the very low level of social trust in the Soviet Union at the time. But on the level of these friendship circles, it was actually quite powerful. That was both a boon and a curse to this, what would be this emerging dissident movement. The movement struggled to expand beyond those intimate circles of adult friends because it was very difficult to trust strangers. You had to know someone or know someone who knew someone. There had to be a personal kind of face-to-face community tie before a circle could expand beyond its pre-existing limits. And Volpin's ideal for the transparency demonstration was that he would show up not knowing who and how many other demonstrators would appear, but that he would hopefully see people that he had never seen before. Because that would be a sign that his message had broken out beyond his own friendship circle and had started to reach other elements of, in this case, Moscow society. That is indeed what he found. Multiple circles, multiple groups of close friends showed up at this demonstration. They all eyed each other with some suspicion because they didn't know people outside their circle. But the estimates of the number of participants range from 50 to about 300 of groups who were there. But this is the birth moment of the dissident movement. The whole thing was over in 3 days. The sentences were probably dictated to the judge before the trial ever began. It's known as telephone justice in the Soviet system. But here's what did not go according to plan. Even though the Soviet government got the guilty verdicts that it wanted, the public fallout from the trial transformed the two writers into heroes. And that transformation was so powerful that new protests were inspired by this trial. New arrests occurred at those protests. New trials were held of the protesters. And the whole thing started to snowball. That's the chain reaction. The thing that allowed the chain reaction to happen and to explode was that the two wives of the defendants, Larisa Bogoraz and Maria Razanova, created their own transcript of the trial. Bogoraz in particular was a trained linguist, was very good at shorthand, and she created an extremely accurate verbatim transcript of the trial. What the lawyers said, what the defendants said, the witnesses, the judges, everything. Even the audience reaction was recorded. Decades later, in the course of doing research at a different archive, I discovered that the Soviet government actually made its own transcript of the trial, probably thinking that it would use the record for its own propaganda purposes, but it was scooped by the wives and their team that managed to make a samizdat book out of this transcript. The bootleg version is true to the original, and may even be better because it includes the audience reaction. People clapping, people groaning, people booing. This transcript circulated around Moscow and then the Soviet Union. It was translated into French, German, Spanish, Italian, became a global production, and portions of the transcript were broadcast back to Soviet listeners who tuned in to the shortwave broadcasts of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, the Voice of America, the BBC, the Deutsche Welle, etc. So this is how the chain reaction was fueled. Trials begat protests, protests begat new arrests begat new trials, on and on and on. People sometimes ask me, well, how big was the dissident movement? How was it able to achieve such global visibility and become such a thorn in the side of the Soviet government? How many people were making this happen? My estimate is that at its maximum extent, the chain reaction and the open letters and petitions that went along with it probably didn't encompass more than 1,000 people. Now you can make a movement out of 1,000 people, but 1,000 people in a country whose population is roughly 250 million at the time really is a drop in the ocean. And one of the extraordinary things, there are many extraordinary things about the dissident movement, but one of them is how so few people managed to have such an outsized impact, both on their own society, but also on the dynamics of the Cold War, the relationship between the superpowers. So the chain reaction unfolds over a period of about 3 years between 1965 and 1968. It culminates, in a sense, with probably the most famous 15 minutes in the history of the movement, and that happened on the afternoon of Sunday, August 25th, when 8 demonstrators, only 8, gathered in Red Square to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, the crushing of the Prague Spring, many of you may have heard of, that had happened only 4 days earlier, on August 21st. 8 individuals showed up, 3 women, 5 men, all of them holding signs that said things like, hands off the Czechoslovak socialist, what was it called? ČSSR? Socialist Czechoslovakia, to your freedom and ours, recycling a slogan from the 19th century about how the struggle against Russian imperialism was working hand in hand with the struggle of non-Russian nations to free themselves of the imperial yoke. The most extraordinary thing about the 8 people who showed up, aside from the sheer courage that it took to do that, was that most of them had never met before. They were strangers to each other. The main motive was that they were spiritual anarchists. They believed that the reason people should demonstrate is because they're following their conscience. They should not be taking directions from anybody, and there certainly shouldn't be leaders who tell people what to do. These were people, after all, who had grown up inside the Soviet system, and they had had it up to here with being mobilized over and over again by the party to do this, that, and the other. To understand dissidents, you have to see them as Soviet people, as people who were formed by the Soviet system, and who used Soviet ingredients to construct a movement of opposition and resistance, but nonetheless very much a Soviet movement built in that context. That's the way, at any rate, I try to understand it. Another way to position this movement is to juxtapose it to a movement that will be more familiar to Americans in the audience, although not only those, and that is the civil rights movement in the United States. So as you all, I'm sure, know, the civil rights movement in this country was grounded in the technique known as civil disobedience. From Tolstoy to Mahatma Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr. to Rosa Parks, to a whole pedigree of thinkers who developed the idea that the only way to really effectively oppose evil practiced by a state was to deliberately violate the laws that sanctioned those evil practices. And as you know, in the American case, it was the Jim Crow laws of the American South that legalized all kinds of racial discrimination. And the technique of the civil rights movement was to deliberately violate those laws by sitting in the front of the bus or by sitting at the whites-only counter at a restaurant and violating all of the other daily forms of apartheid that were practiced in the American South. The people who engaged in civil disobedience knew they were breaking the law and they knew they would be arrested for it, and they accepted that. The strategy, though, was to elicit the interference of a higher authority, and that higher authority, of course, was the federal government. That's why there were National Guardsmen escorting African American students into the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Federal judicial power, the Supreme Court, the President, the National Guard, were trumping local discriminatory legal systems. So that's the case that we know from our own historical experience. One way of understanding the Soviet dissident movement is as a movement that was engaged in civil obedience. That's not their term, I use that by way of contrast, but this was a movement that insisted that everything it did, every protest, every open letter, every petition, was going to be absolutely legal according to Soviet law, and especially constitutional law. And they use that as a challenge. Are you going to arrest us for things that your own legal system says are permitted? This is where we get back to the permitted, forbidden, required. So the transparency demonstration, for example, was organized in such a way as to be absolutely legal. And the demonstration on Red Square also took pains to make sure they weren't violating traffic, that they couldn't be accused of hooliganism or any other excuse to arrest them. It never worked in the case of these demonstrations because of the very low tolerance level for public protest in Soviet society. So the demonstration on Red Square was the most famous 15 minutes in the history of the movement because the KGB got word of it in advance, descended on these 8 individuals, beat many of them, arrested them, put them on trial. That transcript was also smuggled out of the courtroom. But the reason why that was the end of the chain reaction period is that the most forceful and articulate defenders of the voluntarist, the non-hierarchical wing of the movement, I have in mind people like the poet Natalia Gorbanevskaya, the graduate student in physics, Pavel Litvinov, who still lives in New York, one of the few who's still alive, and others. They were all represented at Red Square. So when they got arrested, that essentially removed from the movement the most forceful proponents of conscience-driven protest. 1968 was the first near-death experience of the movement. Not only the crackdown on the Red Square demonstration, that removed 8 people from the equation, but anybody who had signed one of those open letters was now subject to extrajudicial repression by the KGB. That's a fancy word that in practice meant your salary was cut in half, you were fired from your job. If you were a graduate student, you were kicked out of the university. If you were a parent, you were told that your kids would never have a chance of getting into a Soviet institution of higher education. So it's not the Gulag, it's not a psychiatric institute, but it's something that could stop your career dead in its tracks and essentially ruin your life. After 1968, the movement had a kind of crisis. How should it continue? Should it continue at all? Many people thought it was dead and done. But it reinvented itself, and this is where the story gets truly global. It reinvented itself in part under the inspiration of Western human rights NGOs, who had gotten word and wind of what was going on in the Soviet Union and had started to send emissaries to Moscow, mostly Moscow, a highly centralized country, to try to build bridges to these dissidents. This was a very wary encounter at first. Nobody really knew who the other side was. The dissidents were not familiar with a non-governmental organization because that category literally didn't exist in the Soviet Union, where, as I mentioned, the Communist Party essentially had a monopoly on public life. But the most meaningful encounter over time occurred between Amnesty International, founded in 1961, the leading human rights organization of its day, headquarters in London, and a group of dissidents in Moscow. And the more they learned about how Amnesty operated, the way it had cells in different cities that would adopt political prisoners in other countries, the way it maintained a rigorous non-partisanship vis-a-vis the Cold War divisions of the world, striving to adopt equal numbers of political prisoners in the capitalist, socialist, and developing worlds, that is the first, second, and third worlds, to maintain a kind of non-political or apolitical equilibrium. This appealed very much to the dissidents. It appealed to them because, as strange as this may sound, they believed that they themselves were completely apolitical. They saw this movement striving to make Soviet laws real, to give them traction, as being outside the realm of politics. And so when Amnesty, with its language of human rights, said the same thing about its own work, something clicked. Again, I'm going to fast forward just for lack of time, and I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. By 1973, the very first chapter of Amnesty International ever to be opened in the Second World, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, is established in Moscow. And this was very troubling to Amnesty's leaders in London. They were very accustomed to adopting, that's the language they use, adopting Soviet dissidents as their projects, as people who were there, they were trying to help get out of prison or psychiatric institutions, trying to get them recognized globally, publicizing their cause. What they weren't used to, and what I think they had never really contemplated, was the idea that Soviet dissidents could be their partners in this work, in this operation. And they were a little worried that this might not work. Could you have someone who was him or herself a dissident in their own country engage in the kind of work that Amnesty did? Or was that kind of we're above the divisions of the Cold War. We have a purely human rights agenda. Was that a luxury that only people in the Western world, in the democratic world, could afford? And the debates back and forth between the dissidents and the amnesty leaders, several of whom traveled to Moscow to meet with them in person, for me was one of the most electrifying moments in this story. It's really a kind of East meets West story, but in a different key than we're accustomed to. It survived long enough to start appealing on behalf of political prisoners in other countries. It survives long enough to discover that Soviet dissidents pleading on behalf of, say, an arrested communist in Uruguay or a dissident in Franco's Spain, when you get an appeal that's signed by Andrei Sakharov and people who themselves have been imprisoned in the Soviet system, it has incredible moral capital. And Amnesty discovered, after its initial anxiety about having a chapter opened in Moscow, Amnesty discovered that Soviet dissidents had moral capital when it came to Amnesty's international campaigns like no other chapter in the world. These people could speak with authority about what it meant to live in an authoritarian system and to suffer from that. So the movement reinvents itself. So just to refresh your memory, World War II ended famously in 1945. Not so famous is the fact that there was no treaty ending the Second World War. The First World War had its Versailles Treaty. Second World War never got that because the victorious powers fell out with each other so quickly and fell into this new Cold War that they were unable to sign a formal treaty about territory, about reparations. They essentially each went their own way. The Soviets managed their half of Europe and the Western powers managed the Western half. In 1975, after years of painstaking lobbying and conference work and negotiations, Leonid Brezhnev succeeds in getting the thing he has wanted most on the international level, and that is a de facto treaty that ends the war, but most importantly, that formally recognizes the borders that Stalin had carved out in 1945 as the Soviet army swept its way across the territory that the Nazis had captured and all the way to Berlin. Hungary, Romania, those are sanctified by the Helsinki Treaty, and in return for that very substantial gift to the Kremlin, the Soviet government declares that it will honor the various human rights accords that it has already signed and that are reiterated in the Helsinki Treaty. So it's essentially a quid pro quo. Many people in the West thought this was a terrible deal because the Soviets had already signed very similar human rights accords and they had failed to honor them, so really what value was there in just one more piece of paper, whereas the Soviets got something quite tangible. The dissidents saw this as an opening to deliver information about violations of human rights committed by the Soviet state, deliver it to the Western signatory of the Helsinki Accords, who they thought might have more influence on the Soviet government than the dissidents themselves had had. Now I want to return to a second to the comparison with the American civil rights movement. In what I said before, I was trying to juxtapose civil disobedience as a strategy with civil obedience as a strategy, to try to clarify what was so unique about the Soviet dissident movement. But I want to point out that there's a kind of legal choreography going on here, where, if you recall, the logic of the American civil rights movement was bring in the federal government to override local law. And essentially what the dissidents tried to do in the aftermath of the Helsinki Accord was to bring in Western powers, starting with Amnesty International, but much more weightily, the American Congress and the United States government. That would be a form of leverage against Soviet violations of human rights norms that were now captured in this Helsinki Treaty that was infinitely more powerful than a transparency meeting or a letter of protest signed by 200 or 400 dissidents. So in Helsinki, the technique ramps up and becomes truly global, but it's also extremely dangerous because now they have entered the waters of the Cold War. And there's an unwritten rule in the Soviet system that the Kremlin has an absolute monopoly over the articulation of foreign policy. And by the early 1980s, roughly half of those 1,000 people that I mentioned have been forced into exile. they leave the country under conditions such as you can leave in the next 3 days, or we can send you to a forced labor camp. So they weren't literally expelled the way Solzhenitsyn was, put on a plane and sent to Germany, but they were essentially forced out of the country. And of those who remained, many were sent into internal exile, others were imprisoned. The movement was decimated in the early 1980s. This movement lasted just under 2 decades. Its active number of participants probably never exceeded 1,000 people. If you take a different definition of who was a dissident, who was involved in the movement, and say, okay, anybody who produced or consumed a samizdat text, anybody who was part of the networks of dissemination of samizdat, now we're talking about tens of thousands, and we're talking about people in every major Soviet city across all 11 time zones, from Riga in the west all the way to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. How do I know these numbers? The KGB did my homework for me. When they investigated the most famous underground dissident periodical, the Chronicle of Current Events, they spent 2.5 years doing research, and their conclusions showed how many people were parts of these networks and where they lived. So now we've gone from 1,000 to tens of thousands. If we open up the circle even more and ask how many people were listening to what we would now call audiobook versions of those samizdat texts, that is, versions that were read over the shortwave broadcasting networks, the BBC, Voice of America, etc. Here I don't have hard numbers. Here the evidence is anecdotal. But the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming that millions of people made a habit of listening to these broadcasts, especially retirees who had a lot of time on their hands. And as some of you know, the Soviet population was very well educated and was especially well technically educated. Lots and lots of engineers, or to put it differently, lots and lots of people who could buy an FM radio and with just a few adjustments turn it into a shortwave radio and thereby be able to pick up these broadcasts from the other side of the Iron Curtain. So the core of active dissidents was indeed a drop in the ocean in this country. But the number of people who were influenced by their message and by their techniques was much, much larger. The dissident movement never set out to topple the Soviet regime. Remember, it was a rule of law movement. It was trying to reform the Soviet system by making it law-abiding. I like to think of them as practicing a kind of containment of the Soviet government. Not the famous version of containment that was invented by George Kennan, the American diplomat that became the architect of the United States' Cold War strategy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, containing it, with dozens and dozens of military bases encircling the Soviet Union globally. This was a different kind of containment, the kind that was practiced internally, where the instrument was the Soviet legal system itself. They were not striving to topple the regime. They did not aspire to capture the state and run the place themselves. This was foreign to their way of thinking. Their goal was to spread legal consciousness and make the law politically relevant. They failed. They failed in that. As a matter of fact, the outcomes of all those trials where the government got the guilty verdicts but lost the PR battle moved the KGB to step away from the legal system and to rely more and more on extra-legal techniques. So if anything, the Soviet governing system became less law-abiding as a result of dissident pressure to abide by the Constitution. One of the unintended effects of the movement, however, and this is the closest I'll come to a happy ending, but happy endings are not characteristic of Soviet history, but the closest thing to it is that this repeated exposure of the Soviet government's inability to obey its own laws drained legitimacy from the system. It made the system look terribly archaic. There are lots of different ways to be modern if you're a state, but one thing that all modern states have in common is a legal system. You can't run a foreign country without a legal system. It just can't be done. It may be a better or a worse legal system, but you can't be modern without the law. And what the dissidents were able to show over and over again was that this state couldn't even abide by the laws that it itself had crafted. And that discredited it. It discredited it in the eyes of a significant portion of at least the intelligentsia, the educated population of the Soviet Union. It discredited it in the eyes of many of its former admirers elsewhere in the world. And that hollowing out of the legitimacy of the system, I think, is a necessary part. It's not the whole, but it's a necessary part of the explanation of why the system collapsed so suddenly when it did. It's not every day that a superpower crumbles like a house of cards in less than 5 years without a shot being fired. And historians are going to be busy for a long, long time trying to explain why such a powerful system fell apart like the proverbial souffle that gets punctured. There are many components to that mysterious disintegration, but one of them is the draining of the legitimacy of the system as an indirect result of this movement. That's the quasi-happy note on which I would like to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. How come a movement that is mostly known for its writers and books was not only started by someone who dealt with numbers, Yesenin Volpin, and did not really have to write poetry, only to be arrested for it, should we say. And this perhaps applies even Solzhenitsyn, who was also a math teacher and not a writer by education, by kind of trade, right? Writing became acquired in his case. It's probably never inborn, but in his case definitely was something that he added to his identity, his background, his career before he became a writer. So as an historian who is not so fixated, let's say, on writers and books and texts as we are in literary studies, how do you explain this almost inescapable tendency and desire to write, publish, be read, while it sometimes seems really unnecessary? Would this strengthen perhaps the dissident movement had it not been for these culpable books and texts that so many people were, after all, arrested for? What kind of movement would it be had it only stayed within kind of the more abstract kind of logic, numbers, pursuing same kind of demand for legality?
Very significant portion of dissidents came from what we would now call the STEM fields: science, physics, math, computer science, biology. There were humanists, there were writers and editors and linguists and art historians, and there were people who did not work in the life of the mind, who had careers as you name it, engineers, teachers. Those people work in the life of the mind too, but we're not academics in that sense. I've struggled for a long time to explain the high proportion of scientists. And the difficulty of any explanation is that most Soviet scientists, of course, never participated in the dissident movement. So any quality about science as a pursuit or a way of thinking or a set of practices is going to fail to explain why the vast majority of scientists did not join the movement. Mm-hmm. But what I can say is that the scientists who did join were very enamored of the idea of science as a global pursuit. And they resented very much the feeling of being confined to the borders of their own country. World level science was being done in the Soviet Union, but world level science was also being done elsewhere. And they very much wanted connections to those other scientists. They wanted to have an international conversation. And although it's hard to demonstrate this in all but a handful of cases, they really resented political leaders who they considered their intellectual inferiors, telling them what they could and could not read, where they could and could not publish, and with whom they were allowed to speak. So, a guy like Andrei Sakharov, who I mentioned is arguably the most iconic dissident of them all, a truly extraordinary person, he had achieved remarkable professional success long before he ever heard of the dissident movement. He was the inventor and designer of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. He was one of the most lavishly rewarded and praised scientists in the whole Soviet system. And because he was so important, he had a number of face-to-face encounters with Soviet leaders. He didn't meet Stalin, but he met Beria, Stalin's chief of secret police. He met Khrushchev, he met Brezhnev. And Sakharov, in his own extremely modest way, describes these meetings often with a sense of, oh my God, these guys are actually going to control the weapons that I designed. They're not very well educated. They don't have university educations. They are the children of the peasants and the workers that the Soviet Union elevated as part of its agenda of creating a socially just society. But he was profoundly troubled by the gap between his own moral sensibility and that of some, at least, of the leaders that he met. He was probably the highest placed dissident who had the most access to those leaders, but I think the phenomena can be generalized to others. So when I try to imagine a movement that didn't publish books and well, not really books, but samizdat texts and disseminate them, it's hard to make sense of that because the samizdat texts were the means of communication. And furthermore, dissidents insisted that samizdat was not illegal. And they were right. There was no Soviet law banning the dissemination of hand-typed texts, just like there was no Soviet law saying you are not allowed to publish works abroad. There was a lot of gray areas, and they, as part of the ethos of civil obedience, they wanted to test the limits of the legal by engaging in things that they were convinced were actually legal. And that's why, for example, the many different editors of the Chronicle of Current Events really bridled at the notion that theirs was an underground or illegal periodical. They rejected the techniques of the underground revolutionary movements of the 19th century, and they said, we have no reason to hide. What we're doing is legal. And that's why when they signed those open letters, they often included not just their names, but their addresses and their phone numbers. That was a statement.
The other, what seems to me extremely important, even if it goes back some quarter of a century already, namely to an article that a colleague of ours, Sergei Ushakin, published in 2001, something that's called the terrifying mimicry of samizdat. But by samizdat, of course, he meant mostly political texts, not necessarily literature as such, but texts written down, right? And what he argues very iconoclastically, or at least provocatively, quarter of a century earlier, is that the weakness and perhaps the reason for the downfall, ultimately, of the dissident movement was the simple fact that they used the language of the authorities of the power to speak to this power, instead of coming up with any other kind of discourse that would distance them from that same power. So probably this has to do with your construct of civil obedience as opposed to civil disobedience, but on the level of stylistic level.
Yep.
My question was just how perhaps has your attitude to this claim and article and even the title of this article, how has it been changing over the course of so many years? Maybe not as many, as you've been working on this, you had been working on this book.
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar with it, this article was called The Terrifying Mimicry of Samizdat. And as Yasha said, its claim is that samizdat mimicked official language, and by doing that, it was trying to remain within the bounds of the legal, but it ended up either failing to attract or actually turning away Soviet citizens who might otherwise have become participants in this movement. So Sergei Ushakin is a friend of mine, and that's a very important article. It certainly got me thinking in new ways. But here's what I would say. First of all, samizdat was a textual universe. It was as diverse as the society from which it emerged. Every political standpoint, every genre was represented in samizdat. So yes, there were
pieces about Soviet policies, about Soviet law, about the persecution of dissidents. But samizdat also was a mechanism to reproduce a Russian translation of the Kama Sutra and Hebrew language textbooks and bootleg versions of Tolstoy's novels. So you could find everything in samizdat. There's no one point of view or agenda that is represented by it. So what Ushakin did in that article was to sort of pick out the most political zone of samizdat and draw attention to the way in which it reproduced official discourse. But there are still other things to say even about that limited zone. So for one thing, long before that article came out, many Soviet contemporaries of the dissident movement, observers of it, had a hard time taking its strategy seriously. And the most common reaction to Volpin's strategy of civil obedience and promoting the rule of law, was, who are you kidding? The Soviet Union, the Soviet government doesn't care about law. It's a lawless system. It's a bunch of mafiosi running a country with a little veneer of law and ideology, but it's a system of power. And you're acting like children, taking the Soviet Constitution at its word. You're being literal-minded in a situation that demands irony and cynicism, which was the overwhelmingly common attitude towards the Soviet legal system. Like, don't waste your time with it. A Russian colleague once told me, as I mentioned in the introduction, why are you wasting your time on the dissidents? It didn't matter. They didn't get it. They took law seriously, but law didn't matter. So that one reaction to the dissidents' use of Soviet legal language was either they're naive or they're playing some kind of game. It's all a linguistic game with the government. And the idea is to embarrass or humiliate or unmask the government, but so what? It's not going to change anything because the government ultimately doesn't care about whether it's obeying the law or not. So in that sense, I suppose you could say it was mimicry, but Soviet official discourse has much more in common with the language of Marxism and Leninism and Bolshevism than it does with legal language. And the Marxist elements of Soviet discourse were not mimicked by the dissidents. They didn't embrace that. So I guess the bottom line of my response is that I think Ushakin sort of missed the target in that claim that this was linguistic mimicry going on. It was a very studied appropriation of a particular zone of official language and official norms in an attempt to use it as leverage to contain the state.
Thank you. And of course the Soviet dissident movement, as we all know, especially now, is, yes, it's a product of the period that we call the thaw, Khrushchev's thaw, following the death of Stalin. It's also a product of the Cold War, but now that also we thought that the Cold War ended some 3 decades ago, of course now we are no longer even able to say that. On the terminological level, and all my questions seem to be about language, those terms, especially such as, tamizdat and samizdat, especially tamizdat today, by the way, or new tamizdat as it's called, new Cold War, political persecution, political prisoners, these things are not only have brought back on the terminological level, but unfortunately they are of course also back as reality. So my question is almost a cliche, and is a cliche, but still cliches I think have some reason to exist. As an historian, do you believe today that history repeats itself? I mean, of course, the context of the past 3 years, which is not really my question, but I feel that's the question that's exiles, emigres, relocante from Putin's Russia are asking themselves. On the other hand, of course, it's also what's on the mind of Ukrainians, because for them it has been repeated in different forms, and this perhaps is certainly the most atrocious and tragic one, but nevertheless it's not entirely new, right? So it's automatically perceived if not as a repetition, but as an extension or continuation.
Two most important words that you just said were automatically perceived. Humans are hardwired to be pattern recognizing creatures. That's just the way our brains work. We seek out patterns and we use them to make sense of things. And that can get us into a lot of trouble. I don't think that the Cold War never stopped. I think it actually did end. I don't think the Cold War or even a Cold War is being revived right now. Because for me, the Cold War, the historical phenomena that transpired between roughly 1947 and 1991 was grounded on a very explicit and intense ideological opposition. And there is very little ideological opposition separating the United States from Russia or the United States from China. Lots and lots of differences, cultural differences, but those countries are both capitalists, various degrees of intervention by the state, but they're committed to markets. They do not have an eschatological vision of a perfect future which they will achieve, in which the rest of the world is destined to follow in their footsteps. I really don't think that's the case. And what's been going on in the last 3 years in Ukraine, as any Ukrainian would tell you, is not a Cold War. It's a very, very hot war. It's a war in which hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and wounded. And you may say it's a proxy war in the sense that the United States is making the Ukrainian resistance possible, or at least it was until recently. We'll see what happens. But it's not a version of the Cold War. I don't think history repeats itself. As much as the pattern recognition part of our brain wants that to be true and is drawn to pattern recognition, history doesn't repeat itself. And there's an even less applicable saying from which that is drawn, which is that those who don't study history are condemned to repeat it. And as I tell my students, that is quite possibly the stupidest thing that's ever been said about history. First of all, history doesn't care whether you study it or not. It's going to do what it's going to do. Maybe you can learn a few things and avoid some really crude mistakes, but whether you hit the books or not is not going to determine the structure of geopolitical relationships next year or even next month. But even if you leave aside gee, did I study it or not? Did I forget it or not? That's just not the way things work, this notion of repetition. There are patterns, or as Mark Twain put it, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I'm not saying it's total anarchy, but the model of repetition is just too simple, it's too crude to really capture what happens. And yes, the Cold War was a very important episode in the history of the modern world and in the history of the 20th century. But what we're facing now with Russia or with China doesn't necessarily have to just recycle those ingredients. There are genuinely new elements at play, and if we're so obsessed with this model of repetition, we're just not going to pick up the new elements.
You hear this rhyming history, repeating history, mostly by today's neo-Russian dissidents, right? Or those who think very often of themselves as the offspring of Soviet dissidents, even if the things are entirely different.
Yeah.
The slogans sometimes, again, on a discursive level,
sure,
do certainly resonate. And of course, much less often, if ever, probably never, do you hear this sentiment or this illusion that history repeats itself from any Ukrainians. Because this is not a Cold War, and in fact, in the in Soviet history, it's entirely unprecedented, right? There had never been a war which would result in emigration of the discontents and the oppositionist figures, or which would result even in the dissident movement inside Russia. So
yeah, I mean, there are certain parallels. There are lots of political prisoners, again, in today's Russia. Lots of people have essentially been forced into exile because the alternative is just unbearable. The alternative of staying and either being drafted or sent to prison is unbearable. But those are not specific enough, I think, to constitute a new Cold War. And let me just give you one anecdote that brings home to me how different things are today. So when I was doing some research in the minutes of Politburo meetings, We actually have transcripts of a good number of Politburo discussions during the Brezhnev era. And it's amazing. You can be a fly on the wall and listen to, Brezhnev and Podgorny and Andropov and Gromyko talk about the key issues of the day. And there's one moment where Leonid Brezhnev, the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, is complaining to his comrades in the Politburo, right? This is the most powerful political unit of the Soviet state. He's complaining about some bad press in the Baltimore Sun regarding Soviet human rights. Okay, now I'm from Baltimore. So that's my hometown. And I can tell you that the Baltimore Sun was and is a third-tier newspaper. And the fact that the head of the Soviet Union cared what a third-tier American newspaper, or even knew what a third-tier American newspaper was saying about his country, is extremely useful to know. The Soviets were highly sensitive to criticism of their human rights record, which is why the dissidents could get under their skin. I don't think Vladimir Putin cares what the New York Times says about Russia's human rights record. He could not care less. He really couldn't care less. He is impervious to that level of criticism. This is a sign that we're in a different moral universe. It's a different constellation of forces.
You mentioned that Putin does not care. So in terms of the strategy of fire hosing, which I think is pretty obvious that both sides are doing at this point, where they don't really seek this sort of credibility and they make it obvious that they don't care about credibility. So is that what you're saying is distinguishing the current period from previous periods, this difference in press and image?
I think, unfortunately, you're right that our own president is starting to mimic that. If you just constantly flood people with lies, they start being indifferent to whether something's a lie or the truth. And I think a lot of Donald Trump's supporters know that he's lying, but they don't care because he's delivering other things that they want, and for them the lying is almost a kind of theater. And this has been true of Putin for a long time. When the Russian armed forces shot down that Dutch airliner over Ukrainian airspace, and 300 or so people were on board, and the leading news story was that no, those weren't actually people, those were zombies. Nobody believed that. The people who said it knew they were lying. The people who were listening to it knew they were lying. The people who said it knew that the people who were listening to it knew that they were lying. It was all just a mirror game. There's something else, though, at work in Putin's indifference to criticism of the human rights record. Believe it or not, the Soviet Union thought that they had the superior approach to human rights. They thought that only a socialist system could really guarantee human rights because, according to them, human rights depended on an a priori material equality. As one famous phrase puts it, human rights begins at breakfast. So it's all fine and good to talk about freedom of the press, but what really matters is who has access to printing presses, who owns the press, who has access to paper. So they had I didn't have time to go into this, although I do in the book. There was a totally different logic of what so-called real human rights mean or should mean in the Soviet system. So they were very sensitive to criticisms of something that they thought of themselves as excelling at, as being the leaders. That's just not part of Putin's universe, I think.
I just want to focus on the figure of Larisa Yosefovna Bogoraz for a second, because I think that's I agree with you that she's the one who broke the cord on with glasnost. But I think you have to ask, how was she able to do that? Because I knew her very well and went and visited her often. She didn't speak English, actually. So she had help. So there's a network. And that network of people, there's the dissidenti e referenti. I don't know if you know that theory. The referents are still with their jobs in the system, okay? They went to the same school together, and some of them are now sort of outcasts, but they still have these connections that might be in the Central Committee or in some institute or something. So they draw on those people. Then you have to ask, how does she get that press release? It's not like she can just pick up the phone and say, hello, history, give me the AP or whatever. It doesn't, the Soviet Union doesn't work that way. And even today, life does not work that way. But so she has to get to the foreign court, the court. How? She can't go to the U.S. Embassy that's surrounded by the KGB. I mean, it's lit up like, Yankee Stadium. The correspondence a little easier, but you had to have another person coming out to meet you. So you have to ask, who are the people who went out to meet these dissidents, who bothered, and we knew about them? Okay, some guy from the AP who has a Russian heritage, let's say. I mean, we know who those people are. So there's this other factor of these people, because most people are going to stay in their foreign compound and not get into trouble and lose their visa. So what really, so the thing the moment, that sort of magic, it's when she's outside of Sinyavsky Daniel's trial, and some correspondent has learned that it's taking place.
Yeah.
How? Through, I'll put brackets, stuff, nonsense, we could argue about all day. But so she has this moment when there's a hand to reach, to give the palm card to, so to speak. And, I personally don't think you can trust I've read a lot of those Politburo, translated them, of course, for books like Michael Scammell's book and so on. Yeah. Those are important, but when they're torturing somebody, they turn off the tape recorder like they do in Guantanamo. I mean, that's not a source, always. And just one other there's more than 1,000. You have to look at their networks, you have to look at their moral influence, not just their literal jobs that gave them that capacity, and their sort of relations by marriage and so on. It's a complicated. I mean, if you can ever find the name of the person who took her press release, that will be a historical achievement, because we're all looking for that. But
I should let everybody know, this is Kathy Fitzpatrick, who worked with many dissidents in real time, so to speak, as the movement was itself developing, and who has, I've interviewed some of them, but you knew many, many more for a longer period, and I really appreciate that. I had to leave the Western correspondents out of my remark tonight.
Yeah, sure.
Intermediaries, but they are a vital part of the story, because they were often not just the transmission belts, but they also selected the stories that they thought were important and compelling to their readers. They deserve a lot of credit for bringing the dissident movement to the attention of the world, but one thing that I sort of call them on, and they were all men, the correspondents from the Chicago Tribune and the Washington Post and the New York Times, they were in many ways the ones who spread the idea that this was a movement that had leaders. And they, in a sense, chose the leaders. They decided who they were going to shine the spotlight on and who would be left in the shadows. Again, I don't want to take away from the quality of the work that they did, but one of the effects of these correspondents having a significant hand in deciding who would be cast as the leaders of the movement was that the women were sidelined. The only credible candidates for leader of the Soviet dissident movement were men, when in fact we know from the archival records that women, people like not just Larisa Bogoraz, but Lyudmila Alexeyeva and the aforementioned Natalia Gorbanevska and many others were absolutely central to the bones of the movement. You mentioned the torturing doesn't get captured in the transcripts. I've read a lot of interrogation transcripts, and you're absolutely right. There are all kinds of things that they don't capture.
It tells you the bare bones of what happened during the game, but what it doesn't reveal is what strategies were in the mind of this player. What options did they not take? When did they think about bluffing versus intimidation versus distraction of the opponent? So you're right, lots of things don't get captured in these transcripts, but torture is not one of them. The KGB is not engaging in torture after roughly 1956, and we have overwhelming evidence that it really was trying to professionalize itself as an intelligence service. But it wasn't getting very far. Yeah, the psychiatric hospitals were the biggest hole in the system. And as I said, the KGB for a while flirted with this idea of using the court system. They thought maybe they could sort of have their cake and eat it too, but these trials kept backfiring in terms of the moral message that they broadcast to the world. And that's one of the things I'm not trying to let the KGB off the hook here, but that's one of the developments that actually made them, by the 70s, less inclined to be law-abiding and instead engage in the most uncontrolled, unmonitored forms of extrajudicial punishment, including putting completely mentally healthy people in psychiatric institutions next to people who had murdered other people and administering antipsychotic drugs to dissidents, and therefore not changing their minds, but disabling their minds, which, as Solzhenitsyn said, is a form of spiritual murder. But it's not the kind of torture that you would have found in the 1930s under Stalin.
Thank you so much. When you spoke about the dissident movement and the civil rights movement, it could be said perhaps that both were contingent on the political systems of each country, and this resistance was predicated, all differences notwithstanding, on the institutes of reputation and law. Now, of course, as has been pointed out, with Putin, you have something very different. Unfortunately, you have similar tendencies displayed by the Trump administration, and this raises the question of resistance. I'm also, thinking of some of the protests. Some of them were really mass protests you saw in Russia and Belarus. Unfortunately, they did not work out. And I wonder, as a historian, do you have an inclination to resort to political science to ask yourself the question, what forms of resistance could work given the system, and is peaceful resistance in countries like Russia possible and viable when not only the old Soviet constitution, even the new Russian Putin constitution isn't really mentioned by the government?
I think the Putin government has become much more sophisticated in its ability to manipulate its legal system and to change it when it so desires, to maintain the facade of being a rule of law government. I mean, there is quite a facade. There are still courts, there are still judges, there's still an appeal system. Even Navalny had a defense attorney, although his defense attorney's capacity to actually defend him was extremely restricted by what the government did. So after studying this movement and their law-based techniques for many, many years, what I concluded was that the rule of law is an indispensable part of any modern protest and dissident movement, but it's not sufficient. The rule of law alone will not turn the tide against regimes like Putin's. And in particular, I think the dissidents, they encountered a relatively unreceptive society. They often felt very ghettoized within the Soviet Union, but there was also a certain elitism within the movement that made them relatively uninterested in recruiting new members. Part of it was that old issue that I flagged early on of trust. These very intense circles of trust made it difficult to expand. Because let's face it, face-to-face communities can only be so big. If you're at a liberal arts college where there are 900 students, you can recognize pretty much everybody after a while. If you're at Ohio State where there are 40,000 undergraduates, that's not a face-to-face community and never can be one. So the dissidents struggled to transcend their own personal loyalties to each other and grow themselves into the rest of society. And I saw this in the memoirs and in the contemporary letters and other documents that I used. I saw it over and over again, this almost self-imposed isolation after a while. I don't want to let Soviet society off the hook because people, there were sympathizers, to be sure. There were thousands, probably tens of thousands of sympathizers, but not enough people who would come out in defense of the defenders, in defense of the people who were trying to defend rights per se. They were remarkably alone in that pursuit.
I was wondering if you could expand on what you meant when you said Volpin used a mathematical ideal of language to change the law.
I will never understand. It was so complicated and so abstruse. It was called ultra-intuitionism. And when I took some of his mathematical works to my colleagues in the math department at Penn and said, help me out here, can you translate this into terms that a humanist would understand? They scratched their heads and said, no, we don't understand this either. And that's when I gave up. I realized no amount of work was going to crack this code for me. But what I can say is that Volpin's interest in the nature of mathematical truth and the ability of language systems per se to make rigorous truth statements, and his interest in ideal language philosophy of a language that would be purged of ambiguity. I quote him at one point saying, only when we come up with a scientific language will we be able to trust our own thoughts. He was deeply suspicious of poetry and of ordinary human communication. That was the quest that led him to try to invent an ideal language. He failed, but when he bumped into Soviet law in a very practical, kind of on the skin way, he realized that the law was kind of the next best thing. The law was striving for that kind of clarity, and in particular, it was striving for clarity as regards moral injunctions and prohibitions. And that's what he really cared about, because he wanted to have a moral prohibition on the state doing things that its own laws prohibited. So if I were more mathematically adept, maybe I could find more threads that connected his mathematical work with his rights work, his legal work. But his mathematics are just incredibly abstruse, and I'll never really understand them.
Thank you, everyone. And let's
you all
please
for coming.
thank Benjamin once again.
Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Vulcan does remind me of Leibniz with this idea very much. Mathematically,
Little bit of mathematical and powerful happiness.